There's this amazing moment when Paul is writing the Corinthians who want him to be this strong, impressive leader. And he describes having been saddled with what he calls a thorn in his flesh. We don't even know exactly what he means. And he prayed over and over that this debilitating, in some sense debilitating, perhaps physical thing would be taken away from him. And he says God did not answer that prayer. Instead, God spoke to him and said, "My power is made perfect in weakness." And he says, when I am weak in Christ, then I'm strong. And in that, compressed into that moment when Paul is trying to reframe for the Corinthians what real life is, what real leadership is, in that is the paradox of flourishing, that there's something about strength and weakness together. Paul doesn't say you shouldn't care about being strong. He just says, when I'm weak, then I am strong. How do those two things go together? And as I have tried to unpack this, and as I've thought about the broader topics of power and human flourishing, the two words I ended up with that I use in the book are authority and vulnerability. That strength corresponds to authority, the capacity for meaningful action in the world. And weakness corresponds to vulnerability, the exposure to meaningful risk in the world. So if you have vulnerability without authority, that is suffering. That's poverty. That's exposure to risk without the ability to change your circumstances. You can have neither vulnerability or authority. That is, well, that's being in your parents' basement watching TV. It's protected, it's safety, it's withdrawal from the world. And then you can have authority without vulnerability. That's a kind of power. That's raw power. That's the ability to control. That's the promise of every idol. It's what every system of injustice perpetuates, that some people have authority without vulnerability. And none of these is what we're meant for. We're not ultimately meant for poverty and suffering. We're not meant for withdrawal and safety. We're definitely not meant for idolatry and injustice. We're meant for authority and vulnerability together, which is flourishing. And the amazing thing about the gospel and the story of Jesus is Jesus, who was all authority, took on all vulnerability, meets us wherever we are in all these options, and calls us into real life. He's been to the absolute uttermost vulnerability without authority. He could have stayed with authority without vulnerability, but instead he brings them together in his life, death, and resurrection, and calls us into that kind of life. If you want to flourish, you have to act, you have to pursue authority, ultimately you have to offer yourself to the world, and you have to risk. And it's somehow when you combine those two things that you actually have real human life, healthy leadership, and ultimately healthy communities.